Today, this is Cholit Marmara from BSED Math 1B, and for today, I am going to discuss about the 19th century and 20th century and art since 1945. So first is the 19th century. The 19th century was a revolutionary period for European history and a time of great transformation in all spheres of life. Human and civil rights, democracy and nationalism, industrialization, and free market systems all ushered in a period of change and chance. By the end of the century, Europe had reached the peak of its global power. Social and national tensions, as well as international rivalries, festered, however, all exploding in conflict at the beginning of the 20th century. Political change. The 19th century, an age of revolutions, taking inspiration from the French Revolution of 1789. People across Europe challenged aristocratic ruling classes and fought for the development of civil and human rights, democracy, and national independence. Nationalism emerged as a revolutionary claim promising citizens more involvement in democracy, but it was exclusive, imagining a world of national territories inhabited by ethnically similar people. Some visionary Europeans, however, hoped for the unity of the continent beyond national allegiances. Science and technology. Speed, dynamism, and a belief in progress defined Europe at the end of the 19th century. Railways, electricity, cinema, photography, and new theorists in science and medicine affirmed Europe's leading role in this technological coming of age. A time of optimism began. The arrival of the age of railways demonstrated Europe's advance as an assured technological world leader. Industrialization expanded and long-distance travel became possible across all social classes. Imperialism. The 19th century witnessed a globally dominant Europe. Empires expanded, colonies amassed, all pushed energetically forward by the Industrial Revolution. Colonies provided the raw materials and luxury commodities to meet rising consumer demand, in return promising vast markets for European products. Abuse and inequality were excused as a necessary part of civilizing savage peoples. The gradual ending of slavery was followed by new forms of intolerance and racism. Next topic is the 20th century. The 20th century began on January 1, 1901 and it ended on December 31, 2000. The 20th century was dominated by significant events that defined the modern era: six mass extinction, Spanish flu pandemic, World War I and World War II, nuclear weapons, nuclear power and space exploration, nationalism and decolonization, the Cold War and the post-Cold War conflicts, and technological advances. This reshaped the political and social structure of the globe. The 20th century was one of particular worldwide upheaval, ranging from wars to economic downturns to radical political movements. No one can disagree that the years between 19,000 and 20,000 were years of extreme change for artists worldwide. These changes were boldly reflected in the works of avant-garde artists throughout the century. Classical art was being challenged more and more as waves of nationalism and imperialism spread over the world in the early half of the 20th century. Artists explored extreme and varying themes in the years before and after World War I. Those same themes were revisited in the aftermath of Cold World War II, creating an interesting parallel. This article is divided into two sections, 19,000 to 1945 and 1945 to 2000. and focuses on art themes that captured the talents and ideas of some of the most well-known artists around the world. So, as you can see, naay duha ka column. First column is the art movement and years. So, Fauvism in 19,000 to 1908. Cubism 1907 to 1914. Futurism 1909 to 1914. Dada 1915 to 1924. Surrealism 1924 to 1966. Propaganda 1939 to 1945. Existentialism 1945 to 1950. Abstract Expressionism 1950 to 1954. Pop art 1950s to 1970s. Surrealism 1960s to 1980. Neo-Expressionism and Feminism 1980 to 1990. Performance art 1990 to 2000. So, Fauvism and Expressionism. By turn of the century, artists were rapidly making their departure from more classical works and were seeking to express themselves through different means. Fauvism was the short-lived name for the longer-lasting art movement called Expressionism. From about 1905 to 1910, artists sought to explore emotions in new ways, employing the use of bright, vivid colors and emotional images and subjects. This movement is most known for capturing the creations of such famous artists as Henri Matisse. The Fauvism movement eventually faded into the calmer, more thoughtful expressionistic art as Fauvism, which came from the word Fauvis, meaning wild beast, lost popularity. The short movement characterized the years between 1904 and 1908, but engaged much of the first decade of the 19,000s. Next is the Cubism and Primitivism. Pioneered by Pablo Picasso, Cubism sought to deepen the consideration that expressionist artists had created by rendering objects and ideas from different angles, seeking to break up and analyze things. Primitivism was similar by extension and was influenced by American colonization and exploration in the early 19,000s, featuring collages and works made of many different mediums. Cubism and Primitivism explored the human relationship with the mundane and extraordinary and were characterized by their analytic and synthetic qualities. This art movement was also relatively short and reached its height in the years between 1907 and 1911, extending and intermingling with the Futurism movement. However, art scholars agree it had reached the end of its lifetime by 1919. So next is the Futurism movement. Futurism movement, one of the lesser known art movements. Futurism did not produce any works of art that are still widely known by the world today. However, Futurism was an important political tool used by the artists in the years leading up to World War I. In fact, some scholars believe that unrest associated with the Futurism movement may have served as propaganda for World War I. The movement advocated societal revolution and changes in the way of art was made and produced. Largely an Italian movement, the Futurism movement featured growing unrest and unhappiness with the economic climate and producing larger separations between the working and upper classes. So next is the Dada art. Dada art, by the end of World War I, artists realized that the Futurism movement was not answer to their problems. World War I left artists disillusioned, angry, and bitter across the world. Their art was irrational and their ideas radically departed from centuries to art forms. The art produced during the Dada movement was fascinating in the abstract principles and ideas it sought to portray. Some call it anti-art, and some claim it is not art at all because the creators did not consider it as such. Often, the artists of the Dada era sought to mock more classical and conventional artists, as Marcel Duchamp did when he submitted an old urinal to an art museum as a piece of work. Next is the Surrealism. The anger after World War I gradually faded and was replaced by Surrealism, a longer-lasting art movement that explored the human psyche. Pioneering by such artists as Salvador Dali, the Surrealism movement followed the footsteps of many leading psychologists of the day and discovering dreams and exploring what made reality real. Next is the propaganda. Many art scholars argue that all art has its roots in propaganda or religious ideas. While this sweeping generalization is still debated today, it is obvious that some art is indeed used first and foremost as propaganda. Next is the existentialist art. Existentialism as renewed social, cultural, and artistic craze that followed World War II. It concerned a specific set of ideas related to human existence, thought, and ideas that were abstract and generally unique to each individual. Existentialism in art was similar to Expressionism and renewed the same sort of cynical ideas about human existence. So next is the abstract expressionism. In the late 1940s, abstract expressionism sprang up the idea of expressing a state of mind. Consider the birth of modern art. Artists who painted during the abstract expressionism movement wanted viewers to really reach deeply for an understanding of an image. They wanted the ideas about the painting to be free and conventional thinking and believed that their images would have a unique, extensive meaning for each viewer. So next is the pop art. A new brand of art called pop art emerged in the 1950s as a surprising breakaway from previous movements. Artists in the pop art movement felt that abstract expressionist art was alienating the audience and sought to use their art to communicate more effectively with the viewer. So next is the superrealism. Superrealism is in reality a very small movement that further interpreted the pop art movement in the 1960s. However, superrealism produced works of art that were drastically different from pop art and past works. Artists during this movement brought a return to idealism and perfection in their art. Many artists during this time period created their works of art based on photographs. This return to a more classical style of art was short-lived and fell easily to the more political art of the 1970s and 80s. So next is the Neo-Expressionism and Feminism. Surrealism crumbled beneath the powerful emotions that Neo-Expressionism and the feminist movement sought to invoke with their works of art. Neo-Expressionism was a return to the cynical work of the 1940s and the Futurism movement, but lacked the same angry feel. Instead, artists of this era wanted to produce a more careful, serious examination of emotion and expression. They wanted the viewer to be curious and think deeply instead of being enraged. So next is the performance art. The last decade of the 20th century featured art that was largely labeled as performance art. This art characterized the growing use of personal computers, and art was used liberally in new video games, movies, and other technological advances. Art was being used for performance sake and to catch the eye and appeal of the buyer. Art was primarily commercial in the last decade before the dawn of the 21st century. Art since 1945. A classic introduction to art since the end of the Second World War. Movements in art since 1945 tells the story of art across all forms of media over the past 75 years. Revised and redesigned for the first time since 2001. This standard introduction to visual art in the post-war era examines the movement's trends and artists from abstract expressionism to the present day. So, Abstract Expressionism, June 1, 1940. Dates from the mid-1940s to 1950s. Some famous artists are Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning, Lee Krasner, Adolf Gottlieb. They mainly lived in New York City. Can be broken down into two major categories: color-filled painting and action painting. The subject is abstract, reflects the artist's expressions of what is going on his mind. Next is the Op Art, September 23, 1955. Dates from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s. Some famous artists are Joseph Albers, Richard Anoskiewicz, Bridget Riley, Lawrence Pons, and Victor Vasarely. Created both in Europe and the USA, paintings are based on optical illusions. The subject is non-representational. So, Minimalism, September 23, 1960. Dates from 1960s to 1970s. Examples of artists: Donald Judd, Ronald Bladen, Dan Flavin, Sol Lewitt, Robert Morris, Richard Serra, Tony Smith, and Frank Stella. In the US, art is reduced to essentials. The paintings are not representative, they are non-objective. Conceptual art, September 23, 1960. Dates from 1960s to 1970s. Example of artists are Joseph Kossuth, John Baldessari, Mel Bochner, John Cage, Hans Hock, and Dennis Oppenheim. The idea is more important than the object. Reaction against commercialization of art. Next is the Photorealism, September 23, 1965. Dates from mid-1960s to 1970s. Example of artists: Don Eddy, Richard Estes, Audrey Flack, Chuck Close, and Janet Fish. The artist makes a copy of photograph. This subject is the photograph itself. September 23, 1965, Earth Art. Dates from mid-1960s through 1970s. Example of artists: Robert Smithson, Chris Tu, Alice I. Cook, and Michael Heiser. These artists supported the growing ecological movement. The subject is anything that has to do with the earth. Understandable naman kayo na siya. Next is the performance art, September 23, 1969. Dates from 1960s to the present. Examples of artists are Joseph Bios, Alan Capro, Vito Acconci, Laurie Anderson, Chris Borden. Performance art includes music, dance, poetry, and theater and video. The artist's body is always used in the artwork. So next is the Postmodernism, September 23, 1970. Dates from 1970s to today. Example of artists are Michael Graves, James Sterling, Namjoon Pike, Anne Hamilton, Mark Tansey, Barbara Kruger, and Cindy Sherman. Influenced by technological inventions, the subject is traditional such as landscape. Next is the Neo-Expressionism, September 23, 1978. Date from late 1970s to mid-1980s. Example of artists: Francisco Clemente, Sandro Chia, Anselm Kiefer, George Basilitz, and A.R. Prink, George Emendorf, Susan Rothenberg. It is a reaction against conceptualism and abstraction. Therefore, the subject is usually recognizable. So, that's all for my topic. Thank you for listening and have a good day.